Okay, here we are. We have just discussed the overview. We just had an overview of the brainstem, and now here we are. We are about to discuss each brainstem part in slight detail. So here we go. Now we all know that, or you better know how to draw your brainstem. So you could start with the midbrain, and this is the pons, okay, and this is the medulla, okay. As we go along, you will learn how to draw the important parts so you won't forget. Okay, so um, we're going to talk first about the midbrain, then the pons, then the medulla. Okay, so let me take care of that for now. Okay, so let's start with your midbrain. As we all know, your midbrain, um, when you draw the midbrain, you never forget that those two big pillars. Okay, so those two big pillars, um, they're they're the structures that mainly convey the tracks or the nerve fibers coming from the brain going down to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord going up to the brain. So it's a major highway. Okay, so we'll just draw the pons here so we will know the lower um, border of your midbrain. But anyway, when we look at the posterior part of your midbrain, again, you have those parts there. But of course, posteriorly, you have four round objects there. And those would be your colliculi. Okay? Colliculi. Singular is colliculus. So you have two pairs. You have the upper pair, your superior, and your lower pair, inferior colliculi. We'll discuss their features or their functions later on. And then down here, that's already your start of your rhomboid fossa, okay, part of your fourth ventricle. And these structures here, these connect the midbrain to your cerebellum. So these two structures here is your, or are your, superior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so anteriorly you won't find that, and so basically that's the main features of your midbrain. Of course, you don't forget your cranial nerves. You have a cranial nerve coming from the front there. That's your cranial nerve 3. And a cranial nerve that comes from behind and goes out here. Okay? So that's cranial nerve 4. That's the trochlear nerve. Some would call it the idiot nerve because he has to go out the back and wind anteriorly. Anyway, so that's the main, or those are the main structures on the exterior of your midbrain. Now let's go to the interior, okay, the internal anatomy. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut the midbrain like this, okay. So if you cut the midbrain like that, what you now have, this is the anterior, this is the posterior, and we're going to draw that. So you have the colliculi here, and then there, your midbrain is going to look like that. Okay, so let's clean this up. Okay, let's draw that cross section again. You have two hills, those would be your colliculi, and these would be your two pillars. Okay, doesn't look so symmetrical. Anyway, it doesn't have to be symmetrical as long as you know what you're doing. Okay, so that's the cross section of your midbrain. Of course, these would be your colliculi. One important thing or landmark is this one. This is your central canal, or no, that's not your central canal, that's your cerebral aqueduct. Now, this is a very important, not only is this a very important landmark, but it's a very important structure in itself. It is part of your ventricular system. Okay, so anyway, we've already, since we've already touched on the term, I'll just give you a quick preview of what the ventricular system of the brain is. So basically, in your cerebral hemispheres, you have your large lateral ventricles. Okay, each on the left and the right cerebral hemisphere, you have um, uh, a lateral ventricle there. Just on top of that would be your corpus callosum. But anyway, these two lateral ventricles, they drain into your third ventricle. Your third ventricle is actually a very small one, and you would definitely know that because it's in the middle of your diencephalon. You have the two thalamic nuclei, one on each side, and so if you cut the brain in half, basically, you would see the third ventricle, and just after that would be your thalamus. Now, continuing on, from your third ventricle, that's your cerebral aqueduct. And from the cerebral aqueduct, it will drain into your fourth ventricle. And now that's the fourth ventricle where your midbrain is. Okay, so that's your midbrain, that's your pons, that's your medulla there. Okay, and then your fourth ventricle would continue as the central canal of your spinal cord, but at the same time, it also has holes that would allow your cerebrospinal fluid to go into your subarachnoid space, and it will allow the CSF to surround your brain and your brainstem and your cerebellum, and will bathe it, nourish it, and protect it. Okay, so basically, at a glance, that's your ventricular system. Very simple. We just made a slight detour just to touch on that. But anyway, we're talking about the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, very important. Why? Sometimes children are born with a blocked cerebral aqueduct. So what happens? Cerebrospinal fluid builds up here. They could not bring the cerebrospinal fluid out. So what you have is a brain that is gradually expanding. So that's when you see children with humongous heads. They don't have a lot of brain tissue. What they have is a lot of cerebrospinal fluid building up inside. Now, so going back, let's go back to your midbrain. Now, we just described um, a very important landmark. Now, there's another landmark. There's a belt of tissue. Actually, it's another nuclei, a group of neurons over here that also serves a very important function as well as a good landmark. And we call that as your substantia nigra. Now, I don't know why I colored it red. I should have colored it black. Okay, that we're going to do now. So your substantia nigra, it's got to do with movement. And so if you destroy your substantia nigra, you're going to have a problem or a condition called Parkinson's disease, where you have poverty of movement. You have a patient that has or cannot move very well. Now, anyway, your substantia nigra, that's the function, and it's an important landmark because anterior to your substantia nigra, that's what we call your crus cerebri. Okay? So your crus cerebri, basically, it has fibers. This is the great highway. Fibers coming from the brain, especially your primary motor cortex, going down through your corona radiata, going down through your internal capsule. This is the continuation. And it goes down to your pons, medulla, and then spinal cord. Conversely, from your spinal cord, it goes, sensory fibers go up to the upper levels of your spinal cord, medulla, pons, midbrain, internal capsule, corona radiata, and then whatever else, like ultimately your primary sensory cortex. Okay, so your crus cerebri, think of it as your highway. Okay, you have motor fibers there, you have motor tracks or descending tracks, you have sensory or ascending or afferent tracks. Okay, so anterior to the substantia nigra, that's your crus cerebri. Okay, now before I told you that your cerebral aqueduct is another landmark, and it is because um, from your substantia nigra to the cerebral aqueduct, we call that the tegmentum. Okay, and tegmentum. And basically, your tegmentum and crus cerebri, they are collectively termed as your cerebral peduncle. Okay, peduncle. Now, let's erase that one. Okay, so after your cerebral aqueduct, that's another part, that's another area. We call it the tectum. Okay, so the tectum is the posterior part of your midbrain, just after your cerebral aqueduct, and anterior to that would be your tegmentum and crus cerebri. Okay, important nuclei, of course. Remember, when your cranial nerve nuclei emerges from that part of the brainstem, then you would expect those nuclei to be present as well. Okay, so you have your cranial nerve 3 somewhere here, cranial nerve 4 is somewhere here, and people jokingly call the trochlear nerve as really dumb because what it does, it goes at the back and crosses. It goes at the back and crosses. The oculomotor is a bit smarter because goes there in front. Okay. Now, what else? You have your red nucleus. Okay. And then you have your other um, tracks there. Anyway, we'll discuss those tracks when we go to the spinal cord. Um, so just remember, very important track or very important nuclei would be your cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 4, substantia nigra is very important. And lastly, we're going to talk about your colliculi. Okay? So we're going to draw the posterior part of your, looks like an ab, or looks like abs, but kulang one more pair. Anyway, this is the posterior part of your midbrain. And so you have your colliculi there. You have your superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. Now, just remember this. Superior colliculi is usually visual. It's a nuclei that processes visual um, visual reflexes and visual cues. Now, this is very interesting. When you talk about the superior colliculus, you talk about um, spino-visual reflexes. And it's basically part of your spinotectal tract or spinotectal reflex. You have when we study about the tracts of the spinal cord, you have your spinotectal tract, and it's involved in your spinotectal reflex or your spinovisual reflex. I mentioned this before, and it goes like this. Whenever you see something in your peripheral vision, for example, you're walking down the road, it seems empty, but then you notice at the right side or in the peripheral vision, in your peripheral vision on the right side, you see some movement. So what do? If you detect movement on your right side, what do you usually do? You turn your head to the right. Or if somebody who hits you or touches you in your right shoulder, what do? Do you turn to the right or do you immediately turn to the left? Naturally, you turn to the right, to where the stimuli is. So basically, that's your spinotectal reflex. It's basically a part of a, it's also a part, it's a protective reflex. Okay? Whenever you see something, it might be a dangerous animal or a dangerous person or something that might put you in harm's way. So you immediately turn your head and bring all your sensory package to detect or examine whatever you've seen or you've detected on that side. So that's how important your spinotectal reflex is. Now, how about your inferior colliculus? When you talk about your inferior colliculus, think auditory, okay? Sounds. It processes sounds. Okay, you hear something on your left side, your head immediately swivels, okay, to that side. Or your inferior colliculus also detects and processes the tone, the pitch of the sound or music or whatever else. So superior colliculi, visual; inferior colliculi, auditory. So remember that. Okay? Now, we are done with the midbrain. Let's go to your... Okay, now let's go to the pons. Let's draw the anterior view of the pons. So I like to think about it as a wig. It's the biggest part or the most prominent part of your brainstem. So we have to draw the medulla here and your midbrain up here. So basically you have that. So when you look at the pons, let's go with the surface anatomy. There's not much to see about the pons. You just see a large bulbous 1-inch long well, object in the middle. Basically your pons connects the midbrain and your medulla. Okay, again, it's a connection for fibers going up here and for fibers going down. Okay, but not only that, because of its middle cerebellar peduncles, okay, at the back, it's also a conduit for the cerebellum. Okay, so your cerebellum is at the back. Pardon my drawing. And basically your pons also connects the left hemisphere, left cerebellar hemisphere, to your right cerebellar hemisphere. Okay, so when you're, this basically is your corpus callosum for your cerebellar hemisphere. Okay, now so remember that it's a bridge horizontally and vertically. Okay, there's not much else to see except in the middle here you have, you might mistake it for as 2 cranial nerves. Actually, it's not. It's actually just 1 cranial nerve. It's your cranial nerve 5, your trigeminal. Your trigeminal is a very big nerve. Now, the big one here is actually just the sensory branch, and it branches out into 3. Okay? Your, the lowermost part is your mandibular, this is your maxillary, and this is your ophthalmic. So basically, if you draw a person, that's the face, that's a nose, okay, that's a mouth, okay? So basically, how do you divide it? Remember that old helmet that looks like this? Okay? So that's how you divide it. So your ophthalmic is like that part. Okay? Your maxillary is like this part, and your mandibular is like that. Okay? Why so big? Basically, your trigeminal is responsible for the sensation of your entire face. Okay, from your cornea to your forehead to your chin. Okay, now the smaller part here is your motor component of your trigeminal, and then after that, all the other cranial nerves, the 3 other cranial nerves, emerge at the junction point between your pons and medulla. So that's your 6, 7, and 8. Okay. Internally, not much to see there, which is good. Anyway, another important surface anatomy is here in the middle. Okay, you see a big groove, a shallow valley. Okay, we call that the basilar groove. Okay, basilar groove. And the reason for that name is because you have an important artery that supplies your brainstem, okay, which is your basilar artery. Okay, so it's not rocket science. Now, basically that's it. Except if we go posterior. So if you go posteriorly, you will have your rhomboid fossa there. You have your superior cerebellar peduncle. You have your inferior cerebellar peduncle. And then you have your middle cerebellar peduncle, which is basically connected, or that's basically part of your pons. Okay? Now, Okay, so this is the floor of your rhomboid fossa. That's basically the floor of your fourth ventricle. Okay, so we are done with the pons. Let's go to the medulla. Okay, the medulla. Now, the medulla is not, I think it's the most detailed, or well, it has the most prominences in terms of surface anatomy. And so we have to learn how to draw your medulla. Okay? Now, when you're drawing the medulla, this is what you do. First, you draw the midline. Okay? That's your anterior median sulcus. Okay? Just after your anterior midline sulcus, you draw two prominences. Okay? That's your pyramids. Why is it called the pyramids? Because from your primary motor cortex, you have pyramidal cells. Their axons go down up to here, and then they cross, and then they become your corticospinal fibers, or your pyramidal fibers. That's your primary motor fibers. Now, that's why it's called the pyramids. Okay? After that, just after the pyramids, you have another eminence here. Okay? That's your olives. Okay? There's inferior olivary nuclei, superior olivary nuclei, but don't worry, these are olives or olivary nuclei, and their main function is that they're a relay station for your cerebellum. So fibers going into your cerebellum or going out of your cerebellum, they stop over at your olives. Okay? After your olives, you have the third structure, and it's really at the back, and this is your inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so your inferior cerebellar peduncle, well, remember your rhomboid fossa, okay, superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle here, and then at the bottom would be your inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so that's it. Now, let's go back to the anterior view. So, um, the medulla oblongata, its old name, the old traditional name, is that this part of the brainstem is called the bulb. Okay, the bulb, and that name still sticks to the brainstem. You hear about corticobulbar fibers, okay, or you hear about bulbar palsy. Okay, so when you hear about that, when you hear about the bulb, you're basically pointing towards the medulla. But when you say bulbar palsy or corticobulbar fibers, corticobulbar fibers means fibers going to the cranial nerves, which deal with your muscles of swallowing. Okay, um, so bulbar, when you hear about bulbar palsy, remember your medulla. What's important with your medulla is that it has your respiratory centers. Okay, it is where you have neurons checking your CO2 levels, your O2 levels. It regulates how fast or how slow your respiratory rate is. It is also where you have your swallowing centers for our nuclei that's responsible for swallowing. You also have vomit centers there. Okay, so you even have your cardiac centers also in your in your bulb or your medulla. Okay, so it's a very important part. If your medulla gets impinged or pinched, your respiratory centers especially will get um, inhibited and you stop breathing. Now, so basically that's your anterior surface anatomy. Of course, we have to discuss your cranial nerves. Remember, in the brain, you have two cranial nerves. In your midbrain, you have two cranial nerves. In your pons, you have four. And in your medulla, you also have four. Between your pyramids and your olives, you have your cranial nerve 12. Okay? And between your olives and your inferior cerebellar peduncle, you have three. You have 9, 10, 11. Okay? So on the other side, here, here, and here. Okay? So, 2, 2, 4, 4. So we have a neat little number there. Okay? Posteriorly, posterior surface anatomy. So, posteriorly, you also have a long posterior median sulcus. And then, there are two bulges that you will see behind the medulla. That is, to make it easy for you, it's in alphabetical order. C and G. C is your cuneate tubercle. G is gracile tubercle. Why is it called so? Because underneath that would be your cuneate nucleus, and underneath that would be your gracile nucleus. Okay? Now, we'll be dealing what's with that cuneate or cuneate nucleus and gracile nucleus. It's got to do with your dorsal column fibers, which we will discuss when we reach the spinal tracts. It's not going to be very difficult, believe me. Now, when you're dealing with the um, medulla, your textbooks would usually divide it into 1, 2, 3, 4 parts. Okay? Lowermost part, second, third, and most superior. Okay? So, the lowermost part is the area where you have your pyramidal decussation. The Great Pyramidal Decussation. When you hear about pyramidal tracts, you think motor. Okay? So basically, we have to revise our drawing here. Your pyramidal tracts cross at the lowermost part of your medulla. Okay? Second level. This is the level where you have the lemniscal decussation. Lemniscal decussation. Now, if your pyramidal decussation is the great motor decussation, your lemniscal decussation is your great sensory decussation, because your dorsal columns cross here. Okay? Now, your dorsal column tracts, why is it the sensory, called the great sensory decussation? Dorsal columns don't deal with pain and temperature, which are quite important. But imagine this, your dorsal columns subserve your 2-point discrimination, fine touch, vibratory sense, okay, stereognosis. Okay, so when you put your hand in your pocket, and even if you don't look at what's inside your pocket, you probably know what's in there. If you have coins, just by touching the coins, checking their size and shape, you would probably know how much money you have there. If you have a 5 peso coin or a 10 peso coin there, that's those are your fine senses, and that's being carried by your fibers, your dorsal column fibers, and they cross at the lemniscal decussation. The third level is the level of your olives, and we all know olivary nuclei are relay stations for your cerebellum. And the most superior part is the uninspired level, named that level just below the pons. Okay? Anyway, just remember, when you're talking about the medulla, you're talking about life support systems. You have respiratory centers there. You have your swallowing, vomit centers, cardiac centers there. And it is also the site where you have the great motor crossing and the great sensory crossing. Okay? So your medulla might be at the lowest rung, but is also quite important. Now, lastly, at the end, you now have your spinal cord. When do you know, when can you say that it is now the spinal cord and not the medulla? Okay? Number one, landmark. Okay? The landmark, very important landmark, is that hole at the base of your brain, which is called your foramen magnum. That is where your brainstem ends and your spinal cord begins. Of course, you can also use other landmarks. For example, the first cervical C1 or cervical spinal nerve, okay, that marks the beginning of your spinal cord. Okay, so remember, foramen magnum is a very important landmark. Of course, there are conditions. If you have a very tight intracranial space, if you have increased intracranial pressure, it might cause your brainstem to be pushed down, and your medulla might get pinched in your foramen magnum. So what did we say? If your medulla get pinched, your respiratory centers get inhibited and you stop living. Okay? So remember your foramen magnum. Now, so we've discussed most of it, and we just used how many slides? It's also almost 40 minutes. So next meeting or next session would be on the cranial nerves. Okay, how do you test them and what are their functions? So I will see you until then. Thank you for listening.